Welcome to the owner's class for the Singer Classic 44S sewing machine. My name's Devon and I'm going to help you get all set up on your brand new machine. We're going to start by going over what comes in the box and what it looks like when you pull everything out. So you have your machine, obviously. You have your instruction manual, which looks like this. This is really important. Make sure you hang on to this, don't lose it or throw it away. There's lots of useful information in here about how to operate and set up your sewing machine. You have the quick start guide, which is basically like a cheat sheet, so if you have to look up something quickly about threading or bobbin winding or anything about the basic setup. You have your foot control and your power cord. And if you open the storage compartment on your machine, you'll find the rest of your accessories. So there's some spare bobbins, needles, a few different feet, and some other things that we'll talk about in a little bit. We're going to go over how to thread your machine, how to wind a bobbin, how to get it set up, but let's start with a quick tour of the machine parts. We're going to start with something super easy and simple, and that's the power switch. If you reach around the right side of your machine, you can turn the power switch on. A light will come on, that's how you know your machine's on. Right below the power switch is the cord, so this is where the cord plugs into the machine. One cord goes to the wall, to the power source, the other one goes to the foot pedal on the floor. That's how you're going to operate your machine, and it's just like a car. The harder you push it, the faster it's going to sew. Above the cord and power switch is the hand wheel. So you can go ahead and turn the hand wheel. You always want to think of turning the hand wheel towards you. It will make your machine just work better and be less cranky, and thread jams and things like that will happen a lot less often because the hand wheel is meant to only be turned towards you. The hand wheel is like the manual version of pushing the pedal. So if you turn the hand wheel and look over here on the other side of the machine, there's a silver hook that's bobbing up and down. This is called the take-up lever. So this will be important when we thread the machine. Moving to the top of the machine, there is a carrying handle. So if you need to carry or move your machine, you can use this. There's also a dial that's labeled tension. The tension refers to essentially the tightness of the stitches. So for the most part, you can leave it set right in the middle of the scale of numbers, and that is 4. It's really only for doing really specific adjustments or fine-tuning that you need to change your tension. So for the most part, you can leave it right at 4. Moving on down, here by the needle, you'll see a silver pronged piece. That's called the presser foot. And if you reach behind the machine, there's a lever that lets you raise and lower the presser foot. So the presser foot is kind of like park and drive. When your presser foot is up, your machine's in park. When you get ready to sew, you lower the presser foot and it presses the fabric down against the machine, and you can sew whatever you're going to sew. When you get to the end, you lift it to go back to park whenever you're finished sewing. If you feel under the presser foot, there's some little rough pieces that are the feed teeth or the feed dogs. That's actually what's going to grab your fabric and pull it through the machine. Right in front of those feed teeth is the bobbin compartment, so this is where the bobbin's going to go. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then jumping over to the front on the other side of the machine is the stitch selector dial. So that is this dial right here. This is how you tell the machine what stitch to sew when you push the pedal. So your machine can sew all of these stitches, and we have a sample here of all of them stitched out. So you have your basic stitches like your straight stitch, your zigzags, there's hem stitches, there's decorative stitches, there's stretch stitches, and there's a one-step buttonhole. And if you want more detailed, in-depth information about the stitches, you can look on the Singer website at the Stitch Reference Guide for that. So this is the control panel, if you can think of it that way, for your stitches. Above that is the stitch length dial. So this is how you control how long the stitches are. If you look at the stitch selector dial, you'll see that there's stitches that are pictured in black and also stitches pictured in blue. To access the blue stitches for any setting, you would change the length dial to the blue S1. That's going to give you access to all of the blue stitches on the stitch selector dial. Jumping up to the top of the machine, you have your stitch width dial. So this is how you control how wide your stitch is going to be. And then next to that is the needle position dial. So this is how you can move your needle from center position to left or right depending on what sewing technique you're doing. And finally, we have our reverse button or lever, which is this lever right here. This is how we sew backwards, so we're going to use this to help secure our stitching when we sew. So that does it for the tour of the machine parts. Let's get started setting it up by winding a bobbin. The way a sewing machine works, big picture, is that there's an upper thread and there's a lower thread. So when we thread our machine, we're going to start by taking care of the lower thread. So we're going to go down by where the presser foot is and open the bobbin compartment, take off the cover, and inside you'll find an empty bobbin, which is essentially a baby spool that we're going to fill up with thread. Your machine comes with several extra bobbins, but if you ever need more, you want to make sure that you get Singer brand Class 15 transparent bobbins. These are the bobbins that are designed to work with this sewing machine, and using those bobbins will get you the best sewing results. We're going to put our bobbin aside for now and open our storage compartment and find our spool cap, which looks like this. And we're going to take the thread that we're using for our sewing project, put it on the spool pin, which is up here. I'm going to put the spool cap on to make sure that my thread stays on. And now if I look at the top of the machine, I'll see that there are some helpful diagrams to help me remember how to thread it for winding a bobbin. The first stop is the number 1 right here. I'm going to slide it right in there. The second stop is the bobbin winding tension disc, which kind of looks like a screw. And I'm going to take the thread and mimic what this little diagram is showing. I'm going to go in front of it and go clockwise around it. And the most important part of this is that the thread slides under the head of the disc and above that little washer. You should feel some tension or resistance on the thread when you pull on it. It's kind of like flossing. You just want to get it in that little crevice right there. We'll take the tail of the thread and our bobbin, and you'll look for the little holes on the top and bottom of the bobbin. It doesn't matter which side you choose. There's no real top or bottom. You're just going to pick one of those holes and you're going to thread up through the hole from the inside of the bobbin to the outside. So again, we're going in on the inner part of the spool and coming out the top like that. You're going to hold onto the thread tail and we're going to come over here to this piece, which is the bobbin pin. We're going to take the bobbin and stick it down all the way on the bobbin pin. You want to make sure that you push it all the way down. If you don't push it all the way down, then you might accidentally wind thread under the bobbin, which is not what we want to do. Now to tell the machine we need to wind a bobbin, we're going to pop the bobbin pin over to the right, so now the machine knows that it needs to wind a bobbin. We're going to hold the tail up and out of the way, and we're going to push on the foot pedal, and the bobbin will start spinning and winding. Once you wind it for a few seconds, you can stop and trim the thread close to the bobbin because the tail's buried, so it's not going to come unraveled. And then you can just keep filling it. When it's full, it's going to stop by itself. But if you're not going to do that much sewing, you can fill it, about halfway or so. Whenever you're done, you'll stop with the foot pedal and then pop the pin back over to the left, take off the bobbin, and trim anywhere to separate. And then you have your beautifully wound bobbin. Now let's take care of the upper thread. Before you thread the upper thread, there's 2 things you want to check. First, you want to make sure that the presser foot is all the way in the highest position. So you want to make sure that presser foot lifter is not down, it's all the way up. The second thing you want to check is the take-up lever. You want to make sure that this is in the highest position because we need to actually thread it, so it needs to be accessible so that we can see it and thread it. So once those 2 things are set, then you're good to start threading. We're going to undo the thread from the bobbin winding and follow the arrows again and all the numbers. So you can see the first one is the same as it was for the bobbin winding. The second one, number 2, we're going to go right behind this thread guide right here. We're going to follow the number 3 down this channel. We're going to do a U-turn around number 4. For the take-up lever, we're going to mimic exactly what this arrow is doing. We're going to go back behind on the right side, move it over, and bring the thread forward. And it needs to pop right into the front of the take-up lever, so you want to make sure it does that before you move on. We're going to go down past number 6. There is a thread guide right under number 6 that we need to slip the thread into around the right side. And the very last stop before the needle is a thread guide right above the needle. So the easiest way to get the thread in there is to hold the thread horizontally and just tuck it right behind and pull it like that. Again, kind of thinking of it like flossing. The last step of threading the upper thread is threading the needle. The 44S has a needle threader on it, so we're going to use that. The first thing we need to do for that is make sure the needle is in the highest position. The needle threader is right here. It's this white lever. So we're going to snag the thread in this first silver hook, bring the needle threader down, and push it all the way until the tiny little hook goes through the eye of the needle. And then we're going to catch the thread under these prongs and let go. And the needle threader is going to pull the thread right through the eye of the needle. So you can grab the loop that it pulled through and finish the job and pull it the rest of the way through. And we're going to cut this. It's getting a little long. So the last part of threading is inserting the bobbin. So we have our bobbin that we wound before, and our bobbin is a top-loading bobbin. So it's going to go right in the compartment that's already open. The first thing that you need to do is hold your bobbin so that it makes the letter P shape. So imagining that the thread tail is the stem of the P, the bobbin is the top. So holding it just like that, we're going to drop it right into the bobbin compartment. The thread tail needs to go into a groove in the silver metal portion that's right at the bottom of the bobbin compartment, and the groove is at about 6 o'clock. So you want to make sure the thread gets right into that groove. Then we're going to pull the thread up to about 9 o'clock. So the goal here is to get the thread laying in the channel between the silver and the black all the way up to 9 o'clock. And then you can let go of it, just let it hang out. The last thing to do for this portion is hanging onto the upper thread and drawing the bobbin thread up. So you're going to grab the upper thread with your left hand, and we're going to hand crank through a whole stitch. So the needle is going to go down and come all the way back up, and that's going to draw up the bobbin thread. So I'm hand cranking, the needle goes down, and it comes all the way back up. And if we pull with our left hand, we'll see that a loop came up, just like this. So we're going to grab that loop and pull it the rest of the way through. We can take both tails, put them together under the foot and towards the back. And when you're done, you should see your bobbin thread going from about 8 o'clock on the silver portion right there up straight towards the needle. So at this point, we can put our bobbin cover back on, and we're all ready to sew. Once we have our machine all threaded, it's time to test it out, make sure we threaded everything correctly. So we're going to sew a little test seam. The first thing we're going to do is get our machine set up. So you want to go to a regular straight stitch, which is this stitch right here. That's a good stitch for sewing a seam, and that's what we're going to use to test out our threading. You want to have your length set at between 2 and 3, about 2.5. That's a good length for sewing a seam, just sewing 2 fabrics together. The width you can just leave set at 0 because we're just sewing a straight stitch, so you can just leave that at 0. And the needle position, you want to make sure that you are on the center needle position for this seam. Alright, so we're going to take 2 pieces of fabric, our test swatch, and we're going to put it right under the presser foot. And I'm going to use the guidelines to the right of the presser foot to make sure that I sew straight. So I'm going to follow one of those guidelines. And there are some labeled in inches and some labeled in metric, so you can just choose one for this. This is just a test, and we're going to follow it. I'm going to put the presser foot down to get ready to sew, and then I'm going to push the pedal and start sewing. I'll sew all the way to the end. I'm going to stop, and before I pull out my project or my test swatch, I need to look at the take-up lever and make sure it comes all the way back to the top because I want to finish the stitch that the machine is in the middle of sewing. So I'm going to turn the hand wheel towards me until the take-up lever comes all the way back up. I'll lift my presser foot, pull out my test swatch, and cut the threads on the thread cutter, which is right on the side of your machine. And we'll take a look at our stitching. So it's looking pretty good. It looks good from the front, and it looks good from the back. So if, when you sew your test seam, your stitches look a little bit funky, like if they're loopy on the top or kind of weird looking on the back, then that is probably a sign that you didn't do the threading quite correctly, so you can unthread the upper and lower threads and re-thread them and then do another test swatch. Now that we've tested our threading and we know everything is good to go, we can sew a seam for real. So I have 2 pieces of fabric here that I'm going to stitch together. I've pinned them together with the right sides together, so that means the printed sides are touching. For my seam, I'm going to sew with a regular straight stitch, so I'm going to make sure my stitch selector dial is set for a regular straight stitch. And my length is going to be right between 2 and 3, about 2.5. That's a good length for a seam. My width is going to be at 0. Since I'm just sewing a straight stitch, I can leave that set at 0. And my needle position is going to be on the center needle position setting. So I will start by putting my fabric under the presser foot. I'm going to be using the guidelines to the right of the presser foot to make sure that I sew straight, and I'm going to just choose the one labeled 10, so that's 10 millimeters, which is the same as 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to put the fabric under the presser foot and use the presser foot lifter to lower the presser foot. I want the top edge of the fabric just about even with the needle. And I'm going to start by doing something called a back stitch. A back stitch is how we secure our stitching and prevent it from coming out. The back stitch means that we're going to sew forward a few stitches, so I'll push the pedal, sew forward a few stitches. Now I'm going to hold the reverse lever and push the pedal to sew backwards a few stitches. So if you don't back stitch, your project might fall apart a little easier, which would be bad. So you want to make sure that you back stitch whenever you want a seam to stay in place. Now I'm just going to keep sewing. When I get to my pins, I'm going to take them out. You don't want to sew over your pins because you can break your needle or damage your machine. And as I sew, it's not my job to push or pull the fabric, that's what the machine does. It's just my job to keep it straight and gently guide it as it goes through the machine. When I get to the end, I'm going to end with another back stitch, so I'll sew backwards a few stitches, forwards a few stitches. And the final thing to do is to finish the last stitch. So when the machine stops, you want to look at the take-up lever and hand crank the wheel towards you until that take-up lever comes back up to the top. We're going to lift our presser foot, pull out our fabric, and cut our thread on the thread cutter. And here is my beautifully sewn seam. You can cut your thread tails right down to the fabric. And the next thing we need to do is press our seam. Pressing is a really important part of sewing. It's something you don't really want to skip. It will make all of your seams look a lot more professional and finished and nice, and all of your parts and pieces will line up a lot better. So in this case, I'm going to press my seam open. That means that I'm going to separate the sides of the seam allowance like this and press them with the iron so they're nice and flat and smooth. When you're sewing, after every couple of projects, you're going to want to change your needle because your needle will end up getting dull after you use it for a certain amount of time. Some signs that your needle might need to be changed are if it's making a tapping noise as it hits the fabric when you're sewing, or if your stitches start to look a little weird and you've already tried rethreading, that might be a sign that you need to change your needle. Changing the needle is super simple. I'm going to show you how to do it. So first I'm going to just unthread the needle like this. And it's always a good idea for safety at this point to turn off your machine, just to make sure you don't have any accidents. So we're going to start by unscrewing the needle clamp screw. That's this piece right here. So I'm going to unscrew that. And if you need to, you can use your L-shaped screwdriver that came with the machine if it's a little bit tight and you need a little help unscrewing it. So I'm going to unscrew my needle clamp screw until the needle just drops right out. So you would get your new needle, and if we look at the needle, you'll see that there's a thick part and then the skinny part of the needle with a point on the end. The thick part is the part that's going to go up into the machine, and if you look at the thick part, one side of it is flat. The flat side is going to face away from you when you put the needle in. So with the flat side facing away from me, I'm going to insert the needle until it goes all the way in and it hits the ceiling. You want to make sure you push the needle all the way in until it stops. Then we're going to hold onto the needle and tighten that needle clamp screw back up so it's nice and snug. And that's all there is to changing the needle. So your machine comes with several replacement needles, and they're all designed to work with woven fabrics, which is like this quilting cotton that we sewed, or denim, fabrics like that. If you want to sew other fabrics, there's other needles available. So there's the regular point needles. That's what comes with a machine. So that's for the woven fabrics like what I just mentioned. If you want to sew stretchy fabrics, knits like t-shirts or sweatshirts, then you can get ballpoint needles. Those needles are specifically designed to work on knit fabrics. So those are also available if you want to sew something stretchy. And if you want to know more in-depth information about sewing machine needles, you can check that out on the Singer website. So the first thing we need to do is mark our fabric to place our buttonhole. So I'm going to take my tab, I'm going to put my button right where I want it to be on the finished tab, the finished bag. And I'm going to take a disappearing fabric marker and just put a line right at the bottom to mark where the bottom of the buttonhole is going to go. Then I'm going to take a straight edge and I'm going to draw a line straight up from that. So I'm kind of making a capital T, like an upside down capital T. So this is going to be the bottom of the buttonhole, so we'll start there and go up from there. Alrighty, my fabric is ready. Now I need to get my machine ready. The first thing I'm going to do is select my stitch. So the classic 44S has a one-step buttonhole, which is awesome. That means the machine's going to do the whole buttonhole for you. And if you're doing multiple buttonholes, they'll all look exactly the same, so it'll look really professional. So I'm going to choose my buttonhole stitch, which is this icon right here. For the length, I want it to be somewhere between 0 and 1, and you can see there's a buttonhole icon on the length dial to help you remember that. You can start in the middle somewhere and test it out and see how it looks first. Whenever you're doing a buttonhole, by the way, you always want to test it first on the actual fabric you'll be sewing on just to make sure all the settings are right. For the width, we'll go on a width of 6, and for the needle position, we can just have that right in the center. So all of my stitching, my stitch controls and my stitch selector dial are all set, so now we're going to put on the buttonhole foot. So this is my buttonhole foot for this machine, and back here is a place for us to put the actual button that the buttonhole will be for to make sure that it's exactly the right size. So I'm going to take my button and put it right in this area. It slides around, and once you get it in, you can just slide it and snug it up. So you can use a smaller button than this, you would snug it up more, and it slides around and adjusts to the size of your button. So I'm going to look for the pin, which is the silver bar right here. So this is where we're going to attach our foot. So I'll push my presser foot release lever to drop off my regular presser foot, and then I'm going to put my buttonhole foot under the presser foot holder, and I want the part with the button to be behind the needle. I'm going to put the presser foot pin right under the presser foot holder, like that. Get it centered and just very gently lower the presser foot lifter until it snaps into place. You might have to move the foot around a little until you find the spot where it snaps on. Alrighty, I'm going to also pull down my buttonhole lever, which is this piece right here, and you want to be super duper sure that you pull it all the way down. It kind of snaps down at the end. To get set up for a buttonhole, I'm going to push this back, right where it says push, and now my machine knows that it's starting a new buttonhole. I'll take my fabric and place it under the foot. You want to line up the bottom of that T, the horizontal line in the upside down capital T, with the little window in the presser foot. And there are actually some grooves on the side of the presser foot, so that should all be lined up. The grooves, the window, and the horizontal line. And you want the middle of the line, that vertical line, to be centered in the window as well. And you can even crank the needle down towards the fabric a little bit just to be really sure that you're lined up. So once you're lined up, you're ready to go. You're just going to push the pedal down and kind of very gently guide the fabric, but the machine is going to make a whole buttonhole. So here we go. When you get to the end, you want to let it sew about 10 or so times in place, maybe 8 to 10 times, and then you'll stop with the pedal because when it gets to the end, it'll just keep sewing in place. We will finish the stitch we're on with our hand wheel by cranking it until the take-up lever comes back up. I'll lift my presser foot and pull out my buttonhole. So here is my finished buttonhole. At this point, I would just take a hand sewing needle, thread the upper threads through, and bring them to the back of the fabric and tie a knot and cut the tails off. So the last thing I need to do is open up my buttonhole so I can put a button through it. I'm going to take some pins and I'm going to put them through at the top and bottom of the buttonhole because I'm about to cut the fabric and I don't want to accidentally slice through my stitching. I'm going to take the seam ripper that came with the machine and I'm going to put the seam ripper through the fabric right in the center, so all the way through. And you want to be right between your lines of stitching and then carefully slice through everything till you get to the top, to that pin right there. And then we'll turn it around and slice to the other side, just like that. Alright, so we'll take our pins out and there is your buttonhole all finished. If you're doing multiple buttonholes, when you get set up for your next one, you want to make sure that you push the buttonhole lever again and then you'll be all ready to sew another buttonhole. Usually sewing a button on is something that you think of that you have to do by hand. It's going to take a long time, it's going to be really tedious, but actually you can use a sewing machine to attach a button. Buttons are really versatile, you can use them on all sorts of things. Garments, obviously. You could also use them on home decor projects, on bags, like this tote bag here. It has the button and buttonhole closure on the top. So I'm going to show you how to attach a button with the Singer Classic 44S. So I have here a duplicate of my tote bag fabric, and I'm going to put a button right in the middle of it. So first thing I have to do is get my machine set up. So I have a duplicate of my tote bag fabric right here. I'm going to attach a button right in the middle, but first I need to get my machine set up. I'm going to take off the regular presser foot because we're going to use a special presser foot. So I'm going to push the presser foot release lever right behind the presser foot right there. It will drop right off. The next thing I'm going to do is lower the feed teeth, or the feed dogs. This is because I want my fabric to stay stationary, so I don't need the feed teeth pulling the fabric through as I'm sewing. I'm going to slide off the removable storage compartment and reach behind the free arm, and there's a control switch right here, and I'm going to drop that right down so you can see that the teeth dropped. I'll put my storage compartment back on. Now I'm going to attach the button sewing foot. So that foot looks like this, and there's a little metal pin right in the middle. So I'm going to center that under the presser foot holder and very gently lower the presser foot holder down until it snaps into place on that pin. You might need to move the presser foot around a little bit to find the spot where it'll snap into place. So for my stitch, I'm going to go to a zigzag stitch. That's because I want the needle to go back and forth between the holes of the button. So I'm going to switch that to zigzag. I'm going to set my length at 0 since I'm not sewing forward at all. We're just staying in place. And the width setting, you'll want to set it somewhere between 3 and 6. It will depend on the distance between the holes on your button, which we'll test in a second. And the needle position for now we'll just have in the center. Alright, so I'm going to put my fabric under the presser foot like this, and then I'm going to put my button under the button sewing foot, and I want the holes in the button to be centered in that little open space in the foot, just like this. I'm going to lower the presser foot, and now I'm going to use the hand wheel to check my width setting. You definitely don't want to push the pedal until you know for sure that the needle is going to go through both holes without hitting the button. So I'm going to hand crank the wheel towards me, make sure that the needle clears both holes, which it does. So now I'm going to push on the pedal and sew about 10 stitches. Like that. Alrighty, so I've attached my button. Now to tie off the button so that it doesn't come undone, I'm going to go to a straight stitch, which is one click over on the stitch selector. And then I'm going to change the needle position to the left needle position. So this is now going to sew in place in one of the holes. So sewing in place is going to secure the thread and make sure it doesn't come undone. So just like 3 or 5 stitches is really all you need. I'll finish my stitch, lift my presser foot, and pull out my button. And since I did my stitch tie off, I can now just trim those thread tails right down to the button, and my button's all finished. Now that you know how to sew on buttons, you can play around with the technique a little bit based on the buttons that you choose and how you sew them on. So I have a little sampler of some different options you can do when you sew on buttons. We have 3 different widths of buttons, so you can see kind of a wider zigzag, a medium one, and a narrow one. We have the one right here which has the oversized holes but a narrow zigzag. When you're sewing a button that has 4 holes, you can play around with how you attach them. You can do 2 horizontal lines of stitching like this, or you could do an X across the diagonals of the 4 holes, and you can even play around with the thread colors and the way that you stitch them on with 4 holes to make little designs. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and now you know how to sew on buttons. A lot of people seem to be scared of zippers when it comes to sewing, but they're actually pretty simple as long as you know all the steps involved. I'm going to go over how to install a centered zipper on the Singer Classic 44S. I have an example here of when you might use a centered zipper. This is a skirt in progress. This is the back of it, and I have a zipper right in the center back seam. So this is what we'll be doing. Alrighty, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew our 2 pieces of fabric together. So the 2 pieces of fabric that are going to get the zipper installed right down the center, we're going to sew those together. So I'm going to be on a regular straight stitch on my stitch selector dial, but I want to turn the length all the way up to 4. This is called a basting stitch, and we're going to start with a basting stitch because it's going to be temporary. We're going to take it out later, so the length makes it easier to take out. So I'm going to start right at the top. I'm going to use my 5/8 of an inch seam guideline, so I'm going to put the right edge of the fabric right along that line. And I'm not going to start with a back stitch because I'm going to take this out later, so I don't want to make it harder on myself by back stitching. I'm going to sew and baste along the edge, taking the pins out as I go. And we're going to baste all the way to where we want the bottom of our zipper opening to be. So in this case, I've marked it with a different pin. Once you get to that mark, you're going to turn your stitch length back down to a regular construction stitch length, which is between 2 and 3, so about 2.5. And we're going to do a back stitch because this is now the permanent part of our seam, and then we're going to sew the rest of that edge together. And again, you're taking out your pins as you go. You never want to sew over your pins. And when I get to the very bottom, I'm going to do another back stitch, finish my stitch with my hand wheel, lift my presser foot, and pull my project out. So now that my seam is sewn, I'm going to go over to the ironing board and press it open. I'm back from pressing my seam allowance open. Pressing, by the way, is something you definitely don't want to skip for this. If you don't press your seam, your zipper will not look right when you do it. So make sure you give it a good press so that it's nice and flat. I'm going to take my zipper and I'm going to unzip it a little ways, and we're going to put it face down, so coil side down, right against the seam. And I'm going to start by lining up the top of the zipper tape with the top edge of my fabric, and I'm going to pin it in place. And I want to, for the part where the zipper's unzipped, just bring the coil edges together like this. You can pin each side separately if you need to, like that. And we'll put another pin in, like this. And then we'll just pin the rest of the zipper in place. A couple pins will do it. And you want to make sure that the zipper coil stays centered on the seam the whole way down. And it will be very helpful if you have the pull of the zipper facing up when you do this. It'll make a step in a few steps a lot easier. Now that my fabric's ready, it's time to set up my machine. The first thing I'm going to do is change my presser foot to a zipper foot. The zipper foot looks like this, and the whole point of the zipper foot is to be able to sew close to bulky things like a zipper without the presser foot getting in the way. So I'm going to push the presser foot release lever, and the regular presser foot's going to drop right off. And I'm going to take the zipper foot and I'm going to look for the presser foot pin, which is this horizontal bar right here, and I'm going to attach it to the left side like this. So I'm going to put it right under the presser foot holder and very gently lower the presser foot holder down. You might have to wiggle the foot around a little until you find the spot where it's going to snap into place. So the bulk of the zipper foot should be over to the right. Little word of safety. it's super duper important when you're using the zipper foot to only use the straight stitch and to make sure that your needle position is not over part of the metal of the foot, because it's a very tiny opening that you're sewing through, so you don't want to accidentally move the needle over and have it be lined up with the metal, because as soon as you start sewing, the needle will hit the metal and break, and it's not very good for your machine. So we're going to be on our straight stitch. We're going to have our needle in the center position, and for attaching the zipper for the first step, we're going to put our length up to 4. So we're back to that basting stitch because this is a temporary stitch that we're going to take out later. I'm going to put my zipper under the foot. We'll start right at the top, in a little bit from the edge of the tape, and I'm going to put the presser foot down, and you want your needle to be lined up just kind of to the inside of the zipper tape like this. And we don't want to back stitch because, again, this is temporary. We're going to take it out later. So I'm just going to start sewing. I'll take out my pins as I go and just make sure that that zipper coil stays centered along the seam. When I get to the pull, I don't want to sew past the pull because the pull tends to push the foot out of the way and make your stitching line crooked. So I'm going to crank the needle down into the fabric to hold it stable, and I'm going to zip the zipper right past the foot. You can lift the presser foot if you need to at this point and move the zipper right past the foot. We'll put our presser foot down and continue basting. Just want to make sure that your zipper stays centered. And I'm just going to baste down almost to the bottom edge of the zipper tape. It's okay if you don't go quite all the way to the end. We'll finish our stitch, lift our presser foot, and cut our threads. And now we'll go to the other side. Oops. And we're going to flip the skirt around and baste up the other side of the zipper to attach that side. It'll be a little quicker because there's no pins to deal with, but it's the same idea. We're going to baste right along the edge, no back stitching. Just sewing right along. And when we get near the pull again, we're going to go ahead and crank the needle down, lift the foot, and push the pull past. This is why it was nice to have that pull facing up, because now we can just push it right past the zipper foot. And if you need to, you can always move your fabric around. As long as your needle's down in the fabric, it'll hold it stable and in place. Put my foot down and baste to the end. Alrighty. So now my zipper is attached to the fabric. And the reason that we basted first is because now we're going to stitch it from the right side so that it looks really nice and pretty. And the basting will hold the zipper stable, make sure it doesn't move around. Since we can't really see it because it's on the back, that's why we basted first, to make sure it doesn't move. So for my top stitching of my zipper, I'm going to go back to my 2.5 roughly stitch length, because this is a permanent stitch, so I want it to make sure that it stays in, it's not too long. I've also marked on the fabric where the bottom of my basting was on the seam so that I know where I need to pivot to go around the zipper. You want to make sure that this point is not across the bottom zipper stop, which is metal, because you do not want to sew over that, because your needle could break or you could damage your machine, so you want to make sure that you steer clear of the stop down there. Okay, so we're going to start by putting our skirt under like this, with the open end or the top end of the skirt over here to the left. And I'm going to start right on my mark so that my needle is lined up with my mark. I'm going to start about 1/8 of an inch or so behind the seam. So I'm going to be sewing across the zipper. And remember, you don't want to sew over the metal part, but as long as your zipper teeth aren't metal, then you can sew over those. So I'm just going to start, sew right across, and when I get to the other side, I will hand crank the needle down into the fabric about 1/4 of an inch or so past the zipper. I'll lift my presser foot, turn the fabric, and I want to line up the center seam with the left edge of the presser foot right here. So what's going to happen is the presser foot's just going to glide along the zipper as we sew up the side. And you can go nice and slow, take your time if you need to. So right now we're sewing through the fabric and it's catching the zipper tape on the back and attaching it. So when you feel that you're getting close to the pull, we're going to do the same thing we did when we were basting. We'll stop, crank the needle down, lift the foot, and just push the pull right past the foot so that we don't sew next to it. And if you need to, if you're feeling like you're a little cramped or too tight, you can always push the presser foot lifter up even further to lift the presser foot. So I'll put my presser foot back down and keep sewing. When I get up to the top of the zipper, I'll end with a back stitch, finish my stitch, and pull my project out, cut my threads. Okay, so we sewed up one side of the zipper. Now we need to sew up the other side. And just for sake of consistency and to make sure it looks nice and flat, we want to sew in the same direction. So we're going to start at the bottom and sew to the top of the skirt. To do that, I need to switch the foot, which side it's on. Because remember, we put it on so that most of the bulk of the foot was to the right. Now we want to do the opposite. So I'm going to drop the foot off, push it over, and reattach it on the other side of the pin so that the bulk of the foot is over to the left side of the foot. And now what I can do is put the fabric under the same way, but on the other side of the zipper. And now we can do the same thing. We're going to sew up the side of the zipper, and we want the right side of the presser foot now to be gliding along that seam. And you want to start and make sure that you start over your previous stitching. Since we didn't start with a back stitch, which would have been kind of hard to do over the zipper, we're going to start with a back stitch this time and make sure that we secure that initial stitching thread. And same idea when you get close to the pull. Crank your needle down, lift the presser foot, and push the pull right past to get it out of the way. Put your presser foot down and keep going. When we get to the top of the zipper, we'll do a back stitch, finish our stitch, and pull our project out. So now our zipper is all attached, and we can trim our thread tails just to make this a little bit neater. And at this point, you could rip out the basting stitches on the zipper. And then once you do that, you're going to undo the basting stitches in the original seam, which is the really exciting part, because now we're going to see our zipper. So I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to just take a seam ripper and slide my seam ripper right down the center of the seam like that, all the way to the bottom of my top stitching. And here is my zipper. So see, zippers are not scary at all. So since this is a skirt, now that my skirt back is complete, I would continue on with whatever my instructions were, attaching a waistband or a facing, and the top edge will look nice and pretty like that. One of the great things about having your own sewing machine is being able to do your own alterations, like hemming, for instance. Doing a double fold hem is really simple, and it means you can skip a trip to the alterations shop. So I have a pair of pants here, and we're going to do a hem on one of the legs. What you want to do to get your pants ready for hemming is you want to trim them to be a little bit longer than how you want them when they're finished, when they're all hemmed. So about 1.5 inches or so would be a good length. What I've done here is I have pressed up the total extra amount that I trimmed the pants. So whatever amount longer you cut your pants, you'll press that towards the inside. Then you can take the top edge, the raw edge, and tuck it down under and press it again. So you have a nice, neat, clean fold right here. You definitely want to pin it so that it doesn't wiggle around on you while you sew it. And now our hem is all ready to sew. On the machine, we just want to have a regular straight stitch, the usual setup for that. The one special thing we're going to do is take off the removable storage compartment. So we're going to slide this off and set that aside. What that does is it gives us access to the free arm of the machine, which is this right here, which means that we can take our pants and just slide them right over the free arm. Because what we want to do is sew in a circle around the bottom edge of the pants. So being able to put it around the free arm means that we can just turn it as we sew and sew all the way around easily in a circle. We're using a lighter blue thread on this just so you can see it, but when you're sewing your hem for real, you want to look at the original hem and try to match whatever color thread was used originally on the hem, just to make it look the most professional. To figure out where to sew, I'm going to feel through the fabric and feel where that fold is that I pressed into place, and I want to stitch just to the right of it. So on my machine, I'm going to be using what looks like the last seam guideline, but for yours it might be a different seam guideline depending how wide you cut your hem. All right, I will put my presser foot down and I'm going to start just sewing. I'm not going to start with a back stitch. I'll get the back stitch when I come back around to the other side. When you get to the side seams of the pants, just keep in mind that you might have to help guide the fabric a little bit more than usual, just because it is kind of a lot of fabric. So your machine just might need a little extra help getting over it because it's kind of thick. So as I'm going, I'm just turning the whole thing because we're sewing in a big circle all the way around. As I get close to where I started, I'm going to make sure I'm staying nice and consistent with my guideline because I want to trace right over the beginning part of my stitching. And once I get there, I'm going to do a back stitch over the stitching. I'll finish my stitch, lift my presser foot, and pull my project out. So we will cut our thread tails, and our hem is finished. Super fast and super easy.